What's happening, fight fans? It's your boy Jack Slack, and the drought is breaking. Feel that glorious fight energy trickling down on your face. We've got stuff coming up soon, but we're probably going to be talking about most of that on Thursday. Today we're going to be recapping some news. We'll probably keep it short, and we'll do some questions and stuff. Just sort of bringing an end to this period of arduous content creation. But the big piece of news, and probably what we'll focus on for most of today's episode, is the announcement that McGregor versus Cerrone is official, which is, we touched on it last week, I think, but I said I didn't really want to talk about it until they actually do it because they've teased it 1,000 times and never actually done it. Now, apparently, it is official for January 18th. We're in Las Vegas, Nevada, because what do you know? We like money. I would be very surprised if, even if Conor McGregor gets back into title contention and all that sort of stuff, I'll be very surprised if they ever do anything like Russia or Dublin. I mean, they were threatening UFC Croke Park forever, but they never did it. The tax laws are just so much more favourable for people fighting in Las Vegas because that's exactly what they're designed to do. There was nothing in Vegas. They wanted to bring people in. Prize fighting and gambling were the way to do that. Nevada generally, not just Vegas, but you want to live in a socialist utopia, but fight in a hellhole with no tax at all. So naturally, this is the main event. We were, so far it is listed as the main event. There's a few things announced for that card, but nothing, mind blowing stuff that the fight fan will enjoy, which is always nice because it always annoyed me when they did things like UFC. I think it was 190 is the one that I always talk about as one of the worst cards the UFC's ever assembled, which was Ronda Rousey versus Bethe Correia. So you've got half of a fight there, and then they just stacked out the rest with like washed up Brazilians. Because it was in Brazil, and it was still one of the most bought events ever, because it really actually doesn't matter what else you put on the card. People are buying it for the main event most of the time anyway, but, that's the discouraging thing about it. You could just do shit like that. But I think it's better for an overall business model. If you want to get people involved and enjoying the sport, put interesting fights on the undercard. It's not rocket science. I'm sure anyone could tell you that, but for a while the UFC seemed to be getting away from that. But no, it's pretty decent. You've got Andre Fili versus Sadiq Youssef, which is a boy versus boy friend of the podcast special. Love that fight. You got Macy Barber fighting Roxy. You got Halal Kelvin Gastelum versus Drew Dober. Alexei Oleinik versus Maurice Green. Anthony Pettis versus Carlos Diego Ferreira. That was one we were talking about the other day. Banger. And they've just announced Tim Elliott versus Askar Askarov, which puts a couple of weird grapplers in against each other. Though Tim Elliott's last fight was very, very strange. I think he's just so funky. He gets himself into these positions where he thinks he's absolutely fine, and then suddenly like, oh fuck, I should have been defending this guillotine choke more seriously. That was Devison Figueiredo who guillotined him. But returning to this, fight at hand, we've not got a title on the line, but we are going to be main eventing a pay-per-view, because that was the sticking point the last time round. And we talked about this more in the BMF belt bullshit. It seemed like the BMF fight was the chance that the UFC had to test if they could headline pay-per-views without title fights and the world not fall apart. Because all of us were going, yeah, you could do that. We'd be absolutely fine as long as we know the fighters. We will pay for the fights. The UFC were absolutely shitting themselves for some reason, which is part of why they made up the BMF title for that. However, we do have the undercurrent of this fight that it might be heading towards BMF title fight territory because it's at 170 for no reason. They decided they're going to do it at 170, which makes you think the winner is getting a shot at, I say shot, quote-unquote shot at Jorge Masvidal's quote-unquote title for the fake-ass bitch belt, with the fake-ass no wrestling having bitch belt. Which would be sad. That would be very sad, especially as Jorge Masvidal is, at the moment, the most legit of all these fighters. He should be moving into title contention and moving on with his life. But at the moment, he's talking about Nick Diaz, and everyone else is going, yeah, you know what, that's a really good fight. Like Nick Diaz hasn't been retired and drunk for 5 years. It's a very weird situation doing it at 170 because, the McGregor excuse last time that he lost to... the time that he lost to Nate Diaz was that Nate Diaz was enormous. And you're like, you're a former featherweight. Why are you choosing to fight at 170? Just fight at 155. Or if you're at a push, fight at 160. Like, if it's going to be, we're agreeing rules for the bout rather than just going in a standard weight division, why not do that? Very peculiar. In terms of matchups, it's the same matchup it's always been because, Donald Cerrone has existing habits that are among the best established in the sport. He's had 50 fights now. There's tape of probably 45 of them, maybe. He got into the WEC very young and never left, so he's been on TV for quite a long time. He's been televised for quite a long time. He has these habits. He's developed as a fighter, but you can chart every single step of the way, and you can go, oh yeah, that's when he started using the intercepting knee. Oh yeah, that's when he started, ducking in for takedowns on welterweights. But you can also say, oh yeah, look, he's never actually learned to deal with the pressure. His answer to the pressure is the intercepting knee. But with that being said, I think one of the interesting things about Donald Cerrone is that as a fighter, he shows you what proper pressure is by just being so susceptible to it, because you can look at someone and go, yeah, he's probably going to be trouble for Donald Cerrone because of the amount of pressure he brings. And then they'll get in with Donald Cerrone and just come in on wild charges and get hit with knees, or he'll circle off or something like that. Eddie Alvarez, he actually used his footwork really well against. But then you go, oh yeah, no, that's not pressure. That's literally just attacking someone over and over again. And then you put him in with someone like Jorge Masvidal, who's not known for pressuring people, but he showed you just how you can wedge your way up the middle of Donald Cerrone's guard and really make him freak out by just standing on top of him a lot of the time. Some of the reactions to this announcement that it was a 170 were quite interesting. A couple of people I saw pointing out that Conor McGregor came back off 2 years off to fight Khabib Nurmagomedov with no warm-up. That's a pretty ballsy decision. Well, probably we'd say a dumb decision to make. And then decided that he's going to fight Donald Cerrone at 170 when he can comfortably make 155, seemingly just because. It seems like he's the kind of guy who likes to add the challenge to himself, but equally, why not just do what's required? No one's going to give you extra points for it being at 170. But then the other interesting thing that I've seen pointed out is, of course, that if he loses to Donald Cerrone, he has the built-in, it was 170, he's a natural welterweight or whatever excuse, but also it lines up the fight with Nate Diaz very nicely. And I think, even if he loses this fight against Donald Cerrone, I still think that the Diaz-McGregor rubber match could be one of the most lucrative fights available to the UFC at this point still. It wouldn't be anything to do with who's the best in the world, but it would still have enormous ramifications due to the huge fan bases that both fighters have. And also, even if you're a dyed-in-the-wool McGregor or Diaz hater, or just sick of all their bullshit, or sick of their fan bases or whatever, you're not going to look at that as a fight and go, no, I'll never watch that. And I feel this a lot of the time. I'm sick to death of whoever the new talking guy is who's doing well at the moment. But as soon as they fight, I go, yep, cool, I'm going to watch that now. Because you're interested in good fighters in good fights. And the McGregor-Diaz one is a compelling fight. And they've had 2 good fights so far. So, they're hardly going to have a bad third one. I think, aside from the surface level analysis that Donald Cerrone fucking hates pressure and straight hitting and body shots, and Conor McGregor opens every fight by charging across the cage and establishing his stance with the opponent right back against the fence, and then begins throwing left straights down the center and left front kicks to the body, all in service of getting the opponent to lash out at him off the cage, come towards him on a straight line, so he can drop back to his left slightly and crack him with the left counter. That, on its own, seems to match up horribly with Donald Cerrone's tendency to collapse like a flan in the cupboard under pressure, hate straight hitting, hate body shots, and most importantly, really slow starter. If you watch his fights with people like Melvin... I was about to say Melvin Gastelum, Melvin Gillard, oh god, there's loads of them. But, the fights where he starts slow, gets cracked in the head, and then suddenly comes back and is a monster. It's kind of like, I think I said this last week, but he's like a slow starter, but he gets a lot of his finishes towards the end of the first round. It's like it takes him a couple of minutes to get into the fight. He's not a slow starter in the sense that he'll give up a round or two, and then he's a 3rd, 4th, 5th round killer. I think a lot of what we think when we look at this, well, or certainly what I'm thinking when I'm looking at this fight, is how can Donald Cerrone turn the fight in his favour? I'm starting from a position of this is a very tricky matchup for him. There's stuff there that's going to trouble McGregor. Firstly, Donald Cerrone's a longer, taller man, and really, who have we seen him in against that's longer and taller? Was Max slightly taller? Max has a slightly shorter reach than you would expect for a guy of his height. I think it's sub 70, isn't it? He's got like a 69-inch reach or something. Well, maybe I'm making that up, but I do remember being surprised when I read his reach, and I was like, oh, he's actually 3 inches taller than this guy, but got an inch shorter reach. Obviously, reach and height produce the range advantage or disadvantage. You know, if you're fighting someone who's very tall, they might have shorter arms than you, but it doesn't matter because your head is level with their shoulders, so they're punching straight, and their head is way up in the air, so you've got to punch up on an angle. But, you know, the part of the thing with the Diaz, it used to be a thing when, who was it? Max Baer, when he fought Primo Carnera. They were like, Primo Carnera's height saved him from being killed, because they were obsessed with, like, man killers back in the day. Because Max Baer had hit some guy hard enough to kill him. And so had Primo, actually, at some point. Very strange, because they marketed Max Baer as like a man killer, and he basically broke his heart that he'd killed someone by accident. Like, all accounts of it are that that was the moment that he started hating boxing, and then he just carried on because he was a good enough hitter to become the world champion. But there was some of that after the Diaz fight, both the first and the second one. People were like, well, he didn't get knocked out because he's got the height and the reach, and that takes some of the stink off of McGregor's blows. Who knows? Maybe that's true. Maybe McGregor struggles to... to be fair, a lot of McGregor's best counterpunching is over the top of the opponent's right hand. So you watch him crack guys like Chad Mendes and Diego Brandao, and, you know, he's got a couple of inches of height and reach on them. So he can go over the top of their shoulder line, basically. However, boxing is probably not the place that Donald Cerrone wants this fight to play out, because his hands have always been loopy as sin. Except for that one fight where he fought Al Iaquinta and suddenly developed the best jab in MMA. Someone the other day was like, Habib's jab worked against Al Iaquinta because Al Iaquinta had to keep his hands low to stop the shot. And I was like, oh, really? Because Dan Hooker, Donald Cerrone, Jorge Masvidal, and Kevin Lee all jabbed him up too. Well, until Lee gassed. And only one of those guys was going for takedowns. Al Iaquinta just carries his hands in front of his chest and sticks his face out all the time anyway. That's his fighting style. But in that fight, Donald Cerrone's jab looked good. I thought his jab looked good, all right, rather, against Tony Ferguson. But Tony Ferguson, again, another match where they just showed, like, if you get on Donald Cerrone with some pressure, you're going to cause him nightmares. And also the straight kick, the front kick rather, to the body from Tony Ferguson worked fantastically there too. And that was another fight where, you know, for years people used to say, like, you can't low kick with Donald Cerrone, you're giving him the chance to low kick. It's not like if you're trying to hit Joe Frazier with a left hook, you're not engaging in a hooking battle with him. You know, if you low kick someone, they have to pick their leg up, or they have to retract their leg, or they have to take the kick. And one way or another, they're standing still so that you can then follow up and do stuff. That's the point of throwing low kicks against Donald Cerrone. And Tony Ferguson had fantastic success with low kicks against Donald Cerrone. And his kicks are ugly as fuck, because they're not like traditional Muay Thai kicks. They're more pipe kicking kicks. And you don't see that style a lot in MMA. And his front kicks worked fantastically, which was really interesting because you would think that Donald Cerrone would have some kind of answer to those, but he really didn't. He just got stuck with them and sat on the end of them. I think he might have parried one across his body, and Ferguson went into his like spinning back shit. That was really, I mean, as far as Ferguson fights go, it was fairly standard, but it was a strange old fight because any time that Tony Ferguson missed a punch or got out of position, he'd just spin through for a back elbow. And Donald Cerrone ate one early on and then was like, no, I'm not going to press in on you anymore after you turn your back to me. Actually, Dave LeDuc did some similar stuff, which I talked about in that study that I did for the Patreon boys. But I think, like I said, we're coming at this from a position where Donald Cerrone is at a disadvantage here, stylistically. And I would be very interested to see what he can do if he can get to the clinch. Because his takedowns are not great. What he can do well is surprise people with his takedowns, but when he does go for his takedowns, it tends to be a Henan Barao duck in, stick the head out, and shoot towards their hips. You know, it's not, I mean, no one's asking him to do like a traditional knee to the floor shot, but it's kind of like he's ducking him, but he does it over a very long range, and you're thinking, ooh, you could get uppercutted there. Or just end up in trouble if the opponent sees it and steps back or frames off you. Like, a lot of his welterweight run, it was, I'm struggling to strike with these guys because they're as tall as me or taller and longer. And then he'd just, like, go for these takedowns, and sometimes it would work. But if you watch his fight with Mike Perry easily sees the takedown coming from miles away, stuffs it, and then I think he tries to take Cerrone down and ends up getting submitted from there. What Cerrone can do is use that to get into the clinch, which could be interesting because McGregor's clinch, I was decently impressed with it in the second Diaz fight, and to be fair, I was decently impressed against Khabib, because I think a lot of people are looking in the wrong areas for answers to Khabib, but there isn't really an established what to do against Khabib yet, and I thought he did fairly well there. I think the only people who think that he didn't are just, people blinded by their hate for him anyway. I think he did probably better than Dustin Poirier in that position. Obviously, there was some glove holding and silly bollocks, cheating that he should have been penalised for. But in between that too, he was doing the right things. I think the thing is that, like, against Diaz, he was kind of using the clinch to rest and hold Diaz in sort of a traditional boxing clinch, where the overhook is very important in a boxing clinch because that's a better tie-up of the arm in terms of, like, halting them from doing anything. Like a classical tie-up in boxing is one hand under the armpit, the underhook, and then the other, or just hugging around the waist, a lot of the time boxing. But then the other arm is looped over the opponent's arm, and your glove is pressed between your belly and theirs, and you just stick to them, and it makes it very hard for them to hit. In fact, in boxing, guys look for the double overhooks more often too, because that's a position where they can't just free one hand and start trying to hit you in the kidney while you're waiting for the referee to break you. But there were moments in that second Diaz fight where especially if you turn on the corner audio. I don't know why they've stopped doing, like, corner audio and different camera angles and shit on Fight Pass, but that was really good for, like, the month they did it. But you could listen to the corner say, like, grab a hold of him now, Conor, and Conor's got his back to the fence, and he lets Diaz come in on him. Actually, I think he went to Diaz and sort of, like, grabbed him over the back and then fell back onto the fence and overhooks the arm. Because the overhooks were obviously something that he could do to stop Diaz from hitting him along the fence, because Diaz was opening up those flurries on the fence really well. But really, like, his only offense from the clinch in that fight was the turn off the cage and elbow on the orbital and open up the scar tissue, which worked really well, but it was only really one thing he was doing. And then against Khabib, he didn't really do much except for the almost 12-6 elbows when Khabib dropped on his hips. So it'd be very interesting to see if Donald Cerrone could get him into a more, a longer clinch. Not long as in lengthy, but yes, that too. But I mean a longer range clinch fight, as in collar ties and stuff. Not pressing and trying to get the takedown, but using the collar tie and trying to elbow, knee. His fight with Robbie Lawler, there was some good back and forth stuff in that. If you saw him against Hernandez, he did some good stuff off the collar tie in that too. He did that on sort of like the rebound. He'd knee as Hernandez dived in wildly, and then he'd catch him behind the head as he was coming out and try and elbow him. But I'd be very interested to see what Don Cerrone could do with that, because he is the taller man, and obviously if you're the taller man, you can stand a bit taller in the clinches and try and you can try and knee people in the head when you get the chance. But the moment you've got collar ties, or a double collar tie especially, the shorter man has to start worrying and really watch his P's and Q's. Though, of course, there's the other side of that, like Andy Hug, his answer when someone tried to collar tie him in a very early K1 fight was just to swing overhands. And the guy had, like, if you watch really good guys, they tend to frame on the collars really well with their, like, not collar as in neck collar, collarbones with their forearms, and they really feel where you're moving, and they try and keep you off balance. And also they tend to keep their chin down and try and keep it behind their shoulders. And this guy's just got his head up in the air, and as soon as Hug swings over, it just turns his head around and knocks him out. But I think, using the collar ties could be a good idea for Donald Cerrone in this one. Getting a hold of McGregor just generally seems like a good idea, not because I'm of the school that if you touch his legs, he'll fall over. I think we have to accept at a certain point that he's decent enough at stopping takedowns. But when you get a hold of him, obviously you've got some control, like physical control over when he throws his hands, and also you've mitigated that distance trap that he uses. He likes to set himself up just so that he can throw in the long-range kicks on you on the fence and maybe jump in with a left straight or something like that. But he's got this distance where you're at the fence, so you can't go back any further. So he's established a reference point there. But if you lash out towards him, he's just going to drop back a bit and let you fall into the space and then try and crack you over the open side with the left hand. And it's such an effective technique. I wrote a full article on it called The Distance Trap, and we just looked at some different examples of it, from like Anderson Silva to Sean O'Malley. Man, where's he? We need him back. But it's just that convincing people to lash out and as you fall away. And it's very easy to say that's the problem. But dudes, once they're in there and he's kicking them in the body and he's mouthing off, it's very easy to lose sight of that. Whereas if you're saying, okay, we're going to close to the clinch anytime he comes in, you got a bit more. You're taking away that risk of falling in on that punch, which is a lot of Conor McGregor's best shots have come like that. And as much as, bodywork is a weakness for Donald Cerrone, I think bodywork is an important part of fighting McGregor too, because, part of it is like, he uses his head as bait. He has his hands fairly low a lot of the time anyway, and then he wants you to come for his head, and he's going to step back and pull it away. And you've got almost no chance of hitting him if you're engaging him on his terms. But if you can get a hold of him, work knees to the clinch and things like that, or if you can just land some long kicks to the body out in the open, a lot of his stuff is working on the hair trigger and relying on his feet to be in position to spring him back and spring him back in again. He's got like a double movement every time that if you were just retreating and leaving, that's one movement. But he's got to retreat and come back in too. It's a very, you can see why he can't hold it up for the full 5 rounds when he needs to. It's very hard work, and especially hitting as hard as he does. It's not like a lot of it's accuracy and he's finding the right openings, but it's not like he's holding back on these punches either. Side note, Zabit Magomedsharipov came out this week and put out a statement being like, people have often criticised my cardio, but it's actually a tactical choice to gas out in the 3rd round. And the best part is, all the Zabit fanboys are buying it. They're like, yeah, well, when he needs to go 5 rounds, he'll just adapt and go 5 rounds. And you're like, but isn't the whole thing that his movement and his kicks are what make him such a weird fighter to compete against? They're like, nah, when he does 5-round fights, he'll just become a normal fighter and win that way. But anyway, yeah, so Conor McGregor's gas tank, get to the body, slow him down, and slow his feet down. Because if you saw, like, the McGregor fight was sorry, not the McGregor fight, the Mayweather fight was an especially obvious example. He was moving really well, and then he wasn't. And it was because, Floyd kept up the pressure, hit him in the body a few times, and he was going one at a time, just right straight to the body. That was his main weapon in that fight. And, very quickly, McGregor's feet became very flat, and he was having to, he was trying to run away and barely getting away with it, where before he'll be, controlling the distance perfectly, you're on the end of it. Basically, every time that you step to McGregor, he has to take a step back and re-establish his distance. So Floyd Mayweather's plan was just to walk him down and keep making him do it, and hit him in the body anytime he gets a chance, without taking too many risks. And, obviously, to be fair, that's implicit with Floyd Mayweather. He's never going to take a risk. I was watching Luke Thomas get angry about this week when the McGregor and Dana White said they were going to do something again, and Luke Thomas was like, "Yeah, he's just teasing you. He's going to threaten to do MMA or whatever. You're going to go nuts about it, and then he's going to do something that he's almost assured to win because that's what he's done his whole career, and you're just falling for it again." And I thought, yes, brilliant work, Luke. Mayweather is never going to take a fight not on his own terms. I think that's the big divergence between McGregor and Mayweather. McGregor can make the big money for the fights, but does silly things like, I'm going to take 2 years off and then try and fight the best lightweight in the division, having only had 2 lightweight fights. Or I'm going to take another year off and then I'm going to fight Donald Cerrone at welterweight, Not specifically the opponents, Floyd Mayweather. Floyd Mayweather's record gets, undeserved critique because the whole thing was the 49-0 mark, the Rocky Marciano record. Rocky Marciano fought bums up until his last, 6 fights, and then even they were, 40 years old, He spent a whole lot of his time down in Providence. No, not Providence. That's where H.P. Lovecraft's from. He spent a lot of his time down in Massachusetts just fighting schlubs because that's how they thought they'd get his experience level up and make him an attraction, just to have knockout after knockout. And Floyd Mayweather, by the time he was in his 10th fight, was fighting world champions, and he got to 49-0, and most of them were world champions. But I think the difference between Conor McGregor and Mayweather in this context is that I think Mayweather would be fuck going 170, we're going to do it 155, and he'd either announce the fight once he was already almost on weight, or he'd wait until Donald Cerrone put up a photo of him eating cake on Instagram and then be like, fight's on, sign the contract. Anyway, it would be a good fight. The thing is, footwork is so much of fighting, and I think Conor McGregor is just, a lot of his footwork is so much better than Donald Cerrone's. Donald Cerrone, he seems like the kind of guy who, he's got that problem we all talk about a lot, no urgency regarding the fence position. If Stephen Thompson thinks he's even near the fence, he's going to cut an angle and re-establish over in the open somewhere. Donald Cerrone seems chill until his back's against the fence, until his foot's touched it, and then he goes, uh-oh, better start getting off this fence now. And I think Donald Cerrone is the kind of guy who, if Conor McGregor does his usual, run out to the centre of the cage and set up stance, Donald Cerrone will just go, oh, I'm on the fence. Well, better start fighting from here then. I think it's just I think the footwork's going to cost him a lot in this fight, and I think the team are going to have to work out a way around it because it's been 50 fights, I don't know how many years, and he's still never really developed very good footwork or ring awareness, to be honest. Anyway, we'll talk more about that fight when it actually happens. But I'm glad that it's happening, even if the circumstances are fucking weird. I'm also glad that they're not putting a belt on it yet, because I think you should be able to do fights without belts, headlining pay-per-views, and I think you should just build a good pay-per-view around it. I think we get away from the quality of the product. I think that's the root of all problems for any fighting organisation. Put on a good card with some names and with some good fights. You don't have to have names in all the fights, but if people come in, turn the fight on, an hour, 2 hours before when the fight's actually going to start, they're getting ready, they're just milling around, talking to people, whatever they're doing. If you have good fights on there, even if they don't know who they are, they'll go, fucking hell, who's this Zabit Magomedsharipov or whoever? They're not going to be like, I'm not going to watch the fight until I know the main event's on. Everything you put on there is going to seep into their brain. So put good fights on there. Don't give me fucking Jared Rosholt versus John Vellante at catchweight. I don't know. I think I might have just come up with the worst fight ever. I think I might. Anyway, let's... we were still on the news. Let's do some more news. Felder versus Hooker is official for UFC Auckland. Do you know what? I'm going to do more fucking matchmaker stuff because that was one of my first recommendations. I was like, that'd be a good fight. There was a week where loads of I talked about future matchups for people, and about 4 of them came to be. Or were hinted at becoming fights. So I'm going to do more of those hypothetical matchmaker things because it's good fun. And, maybe the UFC give me a 6-figure job. Tyson, that's for the Auckland card. And then you got Tyson Pedro versus Vinicius Marrero on that card too, giving Tyson Pedro a easy softball there. A guy who literally can't strike. And Tyson Pedro is going to blow it somehow, and it's going to be amazing. And then Jake Matthews versus Emil Meek is also on for that Auckland card, which is good. Sad news this week was Kyoji Horiguchi relinquished both his belts, which was Bellator Bantamweight belt and Rising Bantamweight belt, because I think he's blown an ACL, wasn't it? I mean, to be fair, I didn't consider him the Rising champion at the moment because he lost the fight to Kaya Sakura, but obviously because it's Japan, they were like, yeah, non-title. But he had been fighting so much. He got 6-7 fights in the space of a year. I think he had 12 fights in the space of 2 years or something like that, because he did a tournament as well. Spread over Rising and Bellator. The dude is, or certainly was, the workhorse of MMA last year. And I think it's pretty incredible that he managed to go that long without an injury. Because if you're training every day, and first, especially if you're training at American Top Team with some of the best fighters in the world every day, and you're getting that many fights in a year, that's incredible. I don't think it's almost unheard of for a fighter to go a full year without some kind of injury knocking off his schedule. So there you go. If you need more proof that the point fighty karate style is the best way to prolong your career, even in training, Kyoji Horiguchi doesn't get injured. So that's pretty impressive that he managed to keep that going that long. But sad that we're going to be without Kyoji for a little while. But, can't wait for him to come back. Still one of the top bantamweights and flyweights in the world in my mind, and I'm sure in the mind of everyone who's seen him. Horiguchi versus Cejudo, regardless of the outcome of that Asakura fight, that Horiguchi-Cejudo fight would be phenomenal, because you got the guy with the heavy karate versus the guy with the heavy wrestling, but the heavy wrestling guy has the karate and the heavy karate guy has the wrestling. It would be a good fight. And then the other piece of news was that Khabib versus Tony has been, it's not even official, it's semi-official, which is not good, but semi-official for April 18th in Brooklyn. I won't do a fucking hypothetical on that here because, again, I think I've written that article about 4 times now, every time it's been cancelled. So we'll do it nearer the time. I'll do it on Twitch live as they're entering the cage. So, quick recap. What did I watch this week? It really wasn't anything going on. Quintet and Polaris were on. Rockhold versus Nicky Rodz at Polaris. I thought that was good fun. I mean, it was kind of shit because Nicky Rodz wins grappling matches by clubbing people with collar ties and then headbutting them. Luke Rockhold got cut open within minutes, and then they didn't have anything there to seal up a cut, which was a bad move for a start because he got Nicky Rodz competing. And then Luke Rockhold just shouts "I want to keep going. Can you get me some fucking Vaseline?" And there's people, they're appealing to people in the crowd. Has anyone got any Vaseline? So Dan Hardy, I think he was one of the judges, had to jump in and show them how to stop a cut, basically. But But I thought it was good fun. Luke Rockhold was trying to walk him down and just make him use up as much energy as possible. And Nicky Rods was trying to club him with collar ties and headbutt him and then shoot the occasional takedown. There was a nice fireman's carry attempt, but it seemed like they were always off the mats. You know, it's a one-mat event. The mat is on a stage, and then there's a crowd out there in whatever theatre or arena it is. Just buy a double-size mat. You know, that's the solution. You're only doing one match at a time. Just give them more space. And then Quintet was good, because Quintet's always good. I mean, I put up a gif of this on Reddit for everyone, because it warmed my heart. Sakuraba versus Tekken Origami. Firstly, they're the same size, which is incredible, because it's kind of interesting, because they used to talk about doing a 165-pound bout between Matt Hughes and Tekken Origami, when Tekken Origami was the best lightweight in the world, but prize lightweight was 160. And then they used to talk about doing that same weight with Sakuraba versus Hughes as well. And Sakuraba spent, he weighs in for these quintet events at 84 kilos, and he's not any different in shape to his fighting career, but he never cut weight. And then you consider that he fought in the division that now you've got Rob Whittaker, who walks around at like 95 kilos or something like that. He's a big boy now. You've got Paulo Costa, who's easily 100 kilos when he's not cutting weight. Dudes of that size in the same division that he was competing. It's absolutely crazy. But against Gomi, he hit one of his classic, like, sweeping low singles, went round behind him on his knees and knocked him forward. It was an Iron Man match, which is something that Sakuraba's decided is now a cool new thing. But they did two of them. There was Minowa versus Tokoro and Gomi versus Sakuraba. And I think the way that it works is that it has to be sort of like a playful, spirited role more than anything. Because if you actually did this in competitions, I think you'd get guys trying to hold the submission and do as much damage as possible before they released it for the tap. You know, obviously we all go, well, no, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys are cool, but no, we all know someone who would try and like break your leg in the first submission they caught, so that they didn't have to do as much work the next time, or so that you were badly damaged for the rest of the match. It kind of worked because these guys were just sort of larking about, but it was good fun. And then Carpe Diem did well in the team stuff. I mean, the team event is the best part of Quintet. If you've never seen it, it's not like who's going to prove who's the best grappler or whatever, but it is probably the most entertaining setup you can have for a grappling tournament. It's 5-on-5, and then they get a certain amount of time, and if they draw, I think you have to have a certain weights on your team too, so you have to have like a heavyweight and a lightweight and people like that. But if there's a draw, if the time expires, both fighters are eliminated. So you have to basically whose teams. I think they called it survival grappling at one point, but it's basically whose team makes it to the end, and then you restock. You get all your lives back for the next round. So it's really good fun. If you never saw Gordon Ryan run the table against a whole team, including Craig Jones, who's given him some really hard matchups in the past, that's always good too. Let's do a couple of questions. Hi, Jack. The boy Mads Burnell recently spoke about how he's been watching tape on old boxers such as Jersey Joe Walcott, Ezard Charles, Archie Moore and Henry Armstrong, noting that their gloves were similar in size to MMA gloves. And he reasoned that this made those styles of boxing more applicable to MMA because most modern boxers tend to rely on larger gloves for defense. I thought this was a fascinating comparison and I'd love to know your thoughts. Thanks and keep up the tremendous work. Attached is a picture of Ezard Charles wearing gloves that appear very similar to MMA gloves. From Scott, I think those might be his bag gloves, I'm not sure. But we've talked about this a bit before because I think I've also said I like those old school boxing styles and defenses because of the smaller gloves. Things like framing on the opponent's shoulder as you slip to the inside or using a folding guard, stuff like that. Stuff that you're now seeing Mads Burnell use. But if you watch the video that I put up on this very channel, if you're on the YouTube, not on the podcast, but if you go to my YouTube, search for Jack Johnson. There's a segment I took from the history episode on Jack Johnson. I cut some footage to it of Jack Johnson. And if you watch his fights, he uses the clinch a lot. He uses the bicep ties a lot with the thumb webbing the bicep, basically. But there's moments in those fights where he grabs the dude by the wrists. Like, his thumb is separate and malleable enough, the gloves are, that he can grab people's wrists and control them. He was basically hand fighting and Wing Chunning dudes. But obviously, the thing is, if you have the thumb free, and we haven't seen a lot of this in MMA, I think I saw Jake Shields do it to GSP, can't remember who else, but thumbing the eye is always going to be there in the boxing gloves if you don't have the thumb tucked in. So that's one of the things that was one of the later things they brought in, actually, after the glove size got bigger, the padding got more significant. They taped the thumb to the glove. You struggle to find gloves without... Most good gloves you buy now have the tethered thumb. In fact, I believe that's what... I believe. Lucian Carbon and Andy Risti were banned from Glory for some kind of glove tampering. It was all very hush-hush on the down low. And I don't have the full facts on it, so don't at me being like, Jack, you lied. I'm just saying what I heard. I heard there was some glove tampering, and I believe it was to do with cutting the thumb free of the glove. So it's still a very powerful thing to do if you can get your thumb free. Ernie Terrell versus Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was supposed to have thumbed him in the eye. Roberto Duran versus Davy Moore, supposedly too. Because it's so easy to hide too when you're in a clinch. You just need to brush your hand over your partner's cheek and then thumb in the eye on the way by. But yeah, the old styles of boxing cover-ups are really interesting. There's a great book. It's literally sitting here next to me. I haven't read it in months, so I don't know why that is. But I think it was Paladin Press put it out. It was a reprint of the Aviation Training Division Office of Chief Naval Operations U.S. Navy Boxing Guide, or just search boxing on the Paladin Press website. But it's full of these examples of slip to the inside of the opponent's jab, post your hand, press your right hand into their right hand, pushing their guard into their chest so that they can't punch you with that hand, or folding down behind the elbows, things like that. That handsier form of boxing, which we all love. Cheers, Scott. Hi, Slacky. Relatively new fan of you. Found you 4 months ago. And MMA in general, 3 years ago. Your vids and articles have massively helped my understanding of MMA. That being said, I still have shit eyes for grappling ability. That's why when I watched a Sakuraba fight last night, I started to wonder, since MMA and grappling has evolved since those days, how good is his grappling if he were competing today in his prime? I've gained enough knowledge to notice that Anderson Silva was finding success fighting guys who were severely limited strikers back in the day, such as in the Rich Franklin fights, where it was mind-boggling how a champ doesn't know how to deal with the tie clinches. Is this the case with Sakuraba? Was he ahead of his time, as Anderson was, or has grappling not evolved as much as striking has, and would he still be considered a Damian Maia level grappler if he were competing today? Ooh. How well do you think he would match up against today's grapplers? Would Prime Saku achieve anything notable if he were to compete in today's ADCC, or would he not even get past the trials? How well would he match up against modern MMA grapplers like Damian Maia or even T-Ferg with the modern 10th Planet grappling style, or maybe against a wrestler like Habib or Usman? He did well enough against Rampage and Randleman, but again, that was back then, and when it comes to grappling, I can't really gauge skill level just by watching. Thanks from Tan. I think Sakuraba, a couple of interesting things about Sakuraba. He did some stuff that no one was doing at the time, and he did some stuff that guys still don't do now. Shooting low singles, like the one I just shared on Reddit and waxed lyrical about. He was doing that a lot. But a lot of what gave the Gracies trouble when he fought them was that he would turn his back, and because they'd been training jiu-jitsu against each other, since they were children, they had come up with this rule that you don't turn your back. And, this is, as I think it's Ryan Hall said, rules of thumb are there to be understood and then broken, that you don't turn your back except when you do. But they were of the mind that people shouldn't turn their back, and if they do turn their back, you just easily throw in your hooks. You grab a back body lock, throw in your hooks, and then you start choking. Sakuraba would turn his back and go to all fours like a wrestler would, and then the Gracies would try and a lot of the time they would take like a back body lock rather than go for a what Marcelo Garcia calls the seat belt, but that over the shoulder grip. But they go for a back body lock, and then he'd start trying to Kimura them, and obviously. It's kind of weird because they would have grappled wrestlers before, and wrestlers will go to their knees to try and get up again, but you wouldn't have met many wrestlers trying to double wrist lock you or Kimura you or whatever you want to call it. So it was weird. It really was just this one move that they kept playing into over and over again. He would turn his back and they'd grab his body lock, and he'd try and Kimura them, and he did it to 4 of them. 5 of them actually. He fought Halleck and almost Kimura'd him too. Or rolled him with the Kimura and almost armbarred him. And it's interesting because I think I've spoken about this before, but Sakuraba used to roll people with the Kimura, which is still a popular strategy. You roll people with the Kimura, or you roll over the top of them with the Kimura, and you use what's called the Kimura trap or the T-Kimura, and you can use it to come up on their back as they turn into you. Back in Sakuraba's day, he was rolling dudes over and then trying to throw the leg over the face to armbar. And that's, it worked a little, but I think if he'd known if the developments in that Kimura trap system had come along while he was still fighting and grappling, I think it would be interesting to see him use stuff like that. With regards to ADCC, never really know. On the one hand, I've seen him in some grappling matches. His guard passing was never great. And people get really butthurt when you say that, but it really wasn't. And that's why Vitor Belfort, Alan Goes, Henzo to a degree, all these guys worked out that if they laid on their back while he was standing, he couldn't really do anything, and they could try and kick him in the head, if he came in to try and pass. So that's why so many of Sakuraba's early MMA fights are him standing over the dude, kicking him in the legs, because he developed like these little tricks to try and damage them without being able to pass their guard. And a lot of it was also showmanship, like the cartwheel pass and the jump. Neither of those ever really worked, but he did them anyway, just to get up on the scorecards. But the weird thing about ADCC is that it's not really it's not a strict jiu-jitsu tournament. They've got some peculiar rules, like if you go to the turtle immediately after being taken down or passed, the points don't count, which is certainly favors people who are from a wrestling background and can go to their knees as soon as possible. And that would be Sakuraba's answer. So that would be interesting. Also, if you can actually wrestle, that's a huge advantage because it's top tier grapplers who aren't great wrestlers. And Nicky Rodz just came in and out wrestled. Well, no, certainly he didn't take down a lot of dudes, but he got some advantages and won his division just by being a good wrestler. Cabrinho, that was 2 years ago, the ADCC before the last one. He, in the finals against AJ Azagam, he was just picking up single legs and trying to finish them. Despite coming up in the game as like a guard guy, he's now got this good single leg that he uses. So I think Sakuraba in ADCC in his prime would have been interesting, certainly under those rules. ADCC is a weird one because there is this tendency to be like, well, all the guys who win in the gi also win no gi, but there are also these freak exceptions like Hayato Sakurai. He was he was pound for pound number one in the world in MMA at one point. He entered ADCC might have been 2001, might have been 1999, can't remember, but he got silver in the absolute division and the quickest submission in the tournament too. And he heel hooked Rico Rodriguez. But he wasn't a known jiu-jitsu competitor. He was just an MMA guy who was a good grappler, and he came in and got the second place in the most prestigious part of the tournament. I think, the same as anyone, your time is what makes you, but equally, I think a lot of BJJ guys, if they met Sakuraba in his prime, modern BJJ guys would crush him. I think a lot of modern grapplers would crush him. But the way that grappling works is that it just keeps moving forwards. I think it'd be very interesting, it's part of who you train with and stuff like that. I think it would have been very interesting to see Sakuraba training in the modern era of leg locks. If you watched his most recent performance on Quintet, he loves diving on straight ankle locks and things like that. But it's interesting, his organization, Quintet, has banned heel hooks because he thinks they're very dangerous. So that's quite interesting. But, it's like Marcelo Garcia got famous for using the X-Guard. And then, I was watching him teach in Marcelo, on his website the other day. And he was basically saying, yeah, I used to put people in the single leg X-Guard and they just fall over. But now you actually have to work for it. It's kind of like that. If you have something that no one's seen before or no one really works against, or certainly no one is working against someone of your ability in it, that's basically a secret weapon. It's like Damian Maia has a lot of, he says that he's going to do a instructional once he's done competing, but if you're the only guy competing with that little bag of tricks, then you have a massive advantage. But as soon as everyone starts to deconstruct those tricks, it's like the worm guard. Keenan was the man, and then suddenly everyone starts trying to play it, and then even by people not playing it as well as Keenan, dudes in the gym found ways to stop people getting the grips for the worm guard and to make it harder to do. So you got a case where Sakuraba had some ideas that were perfect for that time and for those opponents, but equally, if he were training in the modern day, he wouldn't bring that style forward. He'd be doing other stuff as well. So you never really know. But yes, grappling has come a long way since then. I think if he went in with that skill set to any kind of grappling competition, he'd probably get, he probably wouldn't do that well. Cheers, Tan. Right, I reckon that'll do us for today. I'll be back on Thursday to talk about actual fights that are actually happening. We've got a UFC event this weekend with some pretty good fights on, but I'll write something about that in the week for the Patreon boys. And we got Andy Ruiz Jr. versus Anthony Joshua 2, the do-over. Please get it right this time, guys. 1 for Eddie Hearn. But that'll be happening at the weekend too in Saudi Arabia, so I'll probably be writing something about that for Univet, but I'll talk about it on the podcast too. I'm just excited to have some fucking stuff going on. I'm your boy Jack Slack. If you want to get in on the Patreon, read the conceptual pieces I put out and the fight pieces I put out. Try and do something every week for the Patreon boys. Do that. Supports the podcast. Lets me do it. Even when there's no fights on. Putting out fight content even when there aren't fights. That's my service to the community. And if you want to send an email to the podcast, fightsgonebepodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing at any time, fightprimer.com. I'm your boy Jack Slack. Comment down below if you know what Askar Askarov means.